Welcome to this special broadcast by the Sunday Times and Business Day TV. We're unpacking the latest trends in the elections, and South Africans are preparing to go to vote on May at 29. My name is Mkokeli. My guests are Tanya Meelis, Head of Policy at Cosatu, and the CEO designate at BUSA, Khulekani Mathe. Welcome. Khulekani, I want to hear you come back. Tanya threw quite a jab at you, and you're thinking around getting the private sector to pick up easy assets that belong to the people.
Yeah, let's make this debate a little more exciting. I mean, Tanya, you'd agree. I mean, I didn't use privatization in my reference to the role of the private sector because there are different ways of getting the private sector to participate in commercially viable ways without necessarily outright ownership. I mean, we've been driving on the N3 to Durban, and it's one of the better roads that are in better shape than all the others that have potholes, etc., right? It's because the private sector is involved there. There's a mechanism of the private sector getting involved in these things. So I'm just using that as an example. So we shouldn't always think about it in one way, which is a sale of assets to the private sector. Not that there's anything wrong with that, Tanya. Let's be absolutely clear with that. But there is a way of structuring the participation of the private sector in ways that benefit society, but that are also commercially viable. So I think we should have that openness in this case. And certainly in the case of that you were citing, Mkokeli, in the case of energy, Eskom hasn't been sold. But what the reforms that we are seeing are saying we should actually make this market open and competitive so that other generators, whether they are independent power producers, renewable energy, etc., are able to generate energy, sell it to the grid and benefit society, but in commercially viable ways. So we need to look at that, and those are just some of the examples that we have. So we shouldn't always be stuck on this sort of privatization debates because they don't take us anywhere, and yet society suffers when we hold on to those and don't allow ourselves to look at what works.
Is that your understanding of what needs to be done, though? There's the policy reform, which we've seen in energy, without tinkering with the asset per se, although Eskom is being broken down into three parts. But what do you want? How do you approach these reforms, and how do you see it?
Well, I mean, if one looks, if there's not wholesale selling of assets, there's still the rise of independent power producers and the role that they're playing. Now, no doubt the energy situation is improving because there are more private, rooftops coming on board. It's definitely helping. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is how do you reconcile development and development imperatives with commercial viability at a certain point? Because commercial viability, at the end of the day, any business is still answerable to shareholders and still has to maximize profit. Meeting basic needs is not about maximizing profit. In fact, it costs to do that. And so that's why we still need a very strong state player in that space, so that the private sector can be viable, but also regulated and controlled so that we are able to make sure that we're meeting basic needs.
But this government outgoing administration's policy is that we need strategic equity partners in Eskom, SAA, bad example maybe. So is Cosatu happy with that policy position?
I mean, we'd much prefer strong state ownership than bringing in. That would be ideal. We're not living in an ideal world, though. So practically, we then have to say, well, where there is some moving, where the private sector is being brought in, how are we controlling those kind of deals, which we really would not have as a first option, but to make sure that we're meeting developmental needs.
Okay, so Khulekani, how do you see these things working out when Cosatu speaks the way it does? And it probably should. I mean, it's his position. Tanya represents that's the whole body here speaking.
Yeah, I mean, and I respect that, but just again to come back to the reality that we have in energy. Energy is a regulated industry. We have NERSA, which regulates prices, right? So it's not like the private sector can go in there and charge whatever it wants to. It's a regulated industry, and the rules are set and agreed by the regulators. In the same way that when we come to the transport sector, we now have a bill that has been passed by Parliament that sets out an economic transport regulator bill. Again, this is saying that we do not want the private sectors to simply run roughshod on everybody and as she says, maximize profits, etc., at the expense of society. So these things can be regulated, but in ways that still make them commercially viable, because nobody is going to invest in something that is not commercially viable. I mean, in fact, some of the state-owned entities are failing because of that, of the commercial viability side of things. So if you invite the private sector, that has to be absolutely the condition that it is commercially viable. I mean, not to suggest that there's anything wrong with making profits, because the profits that are made, the shareholders are people like Tanya and I and yourself through our pension funds, which must continue to get a return that pays, for those pensioners. Of course, there mustn't be obscene profits, etc., but profit making is not a bad thing. I know sometimes it gets labeled as though it's a horrible thing. Government makes money out of profits. So when companies make profits, government can only tax profits. Don't take turnovers, etc. So profit making is actually very important for meeting social objectives.
Okay, Tanya?
Can I? So, I mean, profit making is important. We're not saying we want to nationalize the entire economy, right? We accept the important role that business plays in the country. But I want to give another twist to how making profit sometimes stifles our economy. So if you look in the competition arena, where we do have monopolies, and I'm not talking state monopolies now, I'm talking private company monopolies, having a highly concentrated sector closes out space for new businesses to emerge, for small businesses in the sector to grow and compete. It closes out the space for research and innovation. Now, of course, the large companies want to maintain very large market shares. They're doing exceedingly well out of it. Does that benefit all of us? No, it doesn't. So that's a very nice example of how then do we adjust and say, make your profit, but in fact we want the economy as a whole to be doing well as well. And how do we balance that?
I don't think Khulekani disagrees with your point there.
No, there's absolutely no disagreement. Profit making is important. Profit making is important not just for the shareholders, but also for funding social objectives, as we have said. But we're also not talking about profits for the sake of profits, and profits that obviously are at the expense of society. So we would agree with that. But I think we shouldn't take a narrow view of profit in an economy as if it's a bad thing. There may be odd cases where that you're describing, Tanya, but we should be creating an environment in which businesses can thrive, have thriving businesses, because thriving businesses innovate, thriving businesses are able to employ more people, thriving businesses are able to make profit, as I've said, that generate revenue for the state.
Yeah, I don't think Cosatu disagrees with actually the profit motive as well. I mean, we haven't seen them giving up their profits from their investment arm. And take them. Just take all that money, build up nice offices and invest all these cars they use for the campaign. Yeah. How big is your campaign machinery? How much are you putting into that?
Money-wise, I actually don't have the figure on the top of my head. I can tell you...
profit helps.
It gets you more and bigger posters. No, but in terms of human resources, Cosatu has got leadership, membership, organisers on the ground actively mobilising for an ANC victory.
Yeah. And then from your side, Khulekani business side, what's it like tracking in an election of this nature, and what do you guys watch?
I mean, it's obviously quite fascinating, an election, in the sense that this would be our first election in which you have at least the possibility of independents contesting elections. We're going to be voting on 3 ballots, so that's going to be interesting and probably take time for some of the results to start coming through. So that's the part I don't like about it. But on the sort of bigger issue, we've been obviously looking at what economic policies are being promised by parties, especially because, as sort of some indications suggest, that there may be coalition government, possibly at a national level, or even in 1 or 2 other provinces. So who comes into those coalitions, and their policies do matter. And so we've been looking at elections. I mean, there aren't very many differences in this election, just from the promises that are made. There would obviously be the kind of extremes on both the left and the right, but there aren't very many differences. But the policies from the parties that are more likely to be key players in this economy is obviously what we've been looking at.
Okay, all right. In terms of the policy positions there, is there anything that you've seen that you think maybe even from outside of the ANC that is of interest that could come up realistically now?
In the elections, or something that would be implemented in the future?
No, I'm thinking, I mean, you know what your party wants in this election. There's a reality that we could get a coalition, a government, and the other parties will come in with their own interests and policy points.
I mean, I think, certainly we're mobilising for and optimistic that the ANC will be able to get over 50%. But in provinces, there may well be the need for coalitions. I'm sure there will be. It depends on how many. And in that case, it'll have to be worked out on a case-by-case basis and where we are. It's very complex because we need to look at where we've been more successful in coalition, where the ANC-led government has been more successful in coalitions or not, where it hasn't got the majority, but also some key policy principles. Do we agree? Can we get into coalition with certain parties, or can't we? Do we want to be pragmatic and throw principles to the wind, or do we stick to principles?
I guess you guys know better than anybody else how to run a coalition. When you've got a tripartite alliance, you sit together. I don't know if it works or not.
It works. There's certainly benefits.
Okay, let's take a quick break. Thank you.